Apparently, Donald Trump made up a pretty good portion of the conversation between these two men. President Xi said that our two countries should not fight a new Cold War, as he called it, and he reiterated China's 4 red lines. How does that inform, in your opinion, the relationship between Xi and Trump as they get ready to work together again?
Well, it was a good opportunity for President Xi to say to President Trump and to the world that President Xi, basically wants to maintain current China policy toward the United States. And that I'm here in Hangzhou. I'm in China right now. And I can tell you that I've heard that repeated many, many times here. The Chinese do want to work with the United States. The 4 red lines is important. That's raised. It's important that each side made its major points to each other. But the main point here is that the Chinese are ready to deal with the United States. And what the relationship very much depends upon how well, it depends on what Trump does with respect to the United States.
Well, so I am curious, Ambassador, what you're hearing in regard to the potential tariff policy that this incoming president could pursue when it comes to China, knowing, of course, he already implemented a series of tariffs during his first administration. He is talking about a much larger in scope and scale tariff regime this time around, potentially, according to at least our economists here at Bloomberg Economics, the kind of scale that could mean these two economies decouple entirely. How does China prepare for that?
China's concerned. China is very sober, very realistic about potential 60% tariff or across-the-board tariff. All countries, 10 to 20%. Concerned there could be more export controls. They're quite concerned. They're not naive at all. And I must say that the tone of the officials I talked with in the last couple of days is, as I said, sober, but it's also realistic. They're the adults in the room. They're not histrionic. They're not threatening. It's very, very, very solid. Now, basically, China, as I said, hopes that they continue working with the United States, as has been the case in the last several years. I mean, if Kamala Harris had been elected, it would have been pretty much business as usual. But with Trump, they just don't know, but they're ready. One final point here is that if they're ready to go their own way, if Trump's tariffs are too high, if there are too many adverse actions from their perspective by Trump against China.
You know, it's interesting. There's a push and pull here, Ambassador, when it comes to Donald Trump's views on China. As we've reported, he has questioned just about how much support the U.S. should provide Taiwan when it comes to its independence. Elon Musk has talked about the importance of the Chinese market for his company, Tesla. He has also said Taiwan is an integral part of China, which didn't go very well on the island. I guess I'm just curious, how much maneuverability is there within the Trump sphere when it comes to China? We talk about across-the-board tariffs, but is it more complicated than that?
I think it's quite complicated, and frankly, I think the news is better than not. Rubio basically is a hawk against China, and certainly with respect to Taiwan. But Trump likes to do deals. And we know he's talking about a potential deal with Ukraine, who knows with whom else. But I think with respect to Taiwan, you're going to see that Trump want to maintain the status quo. In the campaign, he talks about, you Taiwanese, you got to pay much. You're free riders. You got to pay a lot more for the arms that we're sending you. I don't know how far that's going to go, but I do think that Trump's going to look for a way to deal with China and try to find some accommodation on Taiwan, just as China is going to look to try to find an accommodation with Trump.
Well, as we discuss paying for things here, sir, I apologize for interrupting you. Donald Trump also argues in part that all of the tax cuts he would like to implement during his administration will be paid for in part by tariffs. That'll offset the hit to the Treasury's revenue intake. You used to chair the Finance Committee in the Senate. To what extent does that math actually work?
Well, that's a point I've made many, many times to the Chinese. I explained to them that Trump likes tariffs because Trump thinks, although most economists think this is wrong, Trump likes to think that tariffs will actually create more jobs in the United States. But he also thinks that tariffs will raise a lot of revenue and use that revenue to pay for the tax cuts that expire at the end of next year. Now, I don't know how that's going to play out. Basically, the Republican Party in our country is going to have to figure out what the number is. By number, I mean how much debt can the Republicans stomach as they work to cut taxes. But I don't know. I don't think the increase in tariff revenue is going to be that much of a play with respect to how the Congress decides what to do about tax cuts.
That's really interesting. I want to ask you about what's happening in Ukraine, Mr. Ambassador, by way of China and the way that Xi Jinping is viewing this. We talked on the early edition of Balance of Power with Jane Harman, who chairs the National Defense Strategy Commission, and her comments about Joe Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to strike Russia with these long-range ATACMS missiles that they've been asking to use for months and months. Here's what she said.
Not only were these weapons in Europe, but they should have been transferred long ago. I would hope that Ukraine will also attack military targets. Let's understand what's going on as winter descends on the region. The Russians, in the cruelest act, are trying to take out the energy grid in Ukraine and a lot of civilian facilities. They're attacking Ukrainian cities. They're not just attacking the Ukrainian military. How is this going to end well?
Ambassador, what kind of an impression is this making on Xi Jinping, who's watching his friend Vladimir Putin experience this?
Well, I think there's beginning to be a feeling generally in Europe. I think maybe the United States and also in China, there has to be a resolution of Ukraine. I heard several people here in China say, gee, maybe there could be a resolution similar to Korea. That is, finally, we just take the lines as they now are, and there'll be as with North Korea and South Korea, there could be a Russia and Ukraine. I don't know. But you do hear some talk about that now. It's clear the Chinese are a little upset, frankly, with the 10,000 North Korean troops in Ukraine and with the long-range missiles that are there too. China has a hard time dealing, frankly, with North Korea, with Kim Jong-un. I can remember in a meeting I attended with President Xi, this is a few years ago, and President Obama. President Xi said, well, I can't deal with that young guy. I don't know how to handle him. Kim Jong-un gets under Xi Jinping's skin. But I think my overall sense, listening to Jane Harman, she asked, how's this going to end? I think a lot of people are starting to think we got to figure out how we end this thing. And this thing so we're not always continually sending more missiles, more troops. There's got to be a non-military solution of some kind.